She saw him before anyone announced him, which was the cruelty of it. The first great ball of the Dunvale season had brought every household in the county to Ashcroft Hall, and the ballroom was everything ballrooms in the second decade of the 19th century were designed to be: a machine of visibility, a room whose single function was to ensure that nothing and no one could be overlooked. 300 candles burned in the chandeliers above. The orchestra occupied the gallery on the east wall, their strings weaving through the warm air with the patient insistence of something that knew it would outlast the evening. Silk moved, and jewels caught the light, and the whole apparatus of the season revolved with its usual terrible efficiency. Margaret, Duchess of Ashcroft, stood at the far end of the room near the terrace doors, holding a glass of ratafia she had no intention of drinking, and she was not looking at any of it. She was looking at the man who had just entered through the opposite door. He was taller than she remembered. That was her first thought, and the absurdity of it did not escape her. He had been 17 when she last saw him. Of course he was taller. He wore a navy tailcoat with a precision that suggested it had taken years to learn, and he wore it well. His dark hair was cut shorter than the fashion of his youth had required, and there was a stillness to him now that had not been there at 17, a quality of contained attention, as though he had learned to use very little visible energy and accomplish a great deal. He did not look at her. He spoke to someone at his elbow, nodded once, and moved into the room with the measured ease of a man who had decided, at some prior point, that he would not hurry for anyone. Thomas Vane, Earl of Dunvale. The title still seemed improbable. It had seemed improbable when she first read it in the Gazette, 3 months prior, her hands very still in her lap, so that Lady Constance, seated across the drawing room, would not see them tremble. The Vane family had held a minor baronetcy generations back, the title long dormant. A distant relation's death in the French campaigns had revived it, and the lawyers had spent 6 years tracing the legitimate heir. The legitimate heir had turned out to be a man who had once cleaned the stalls at her father's estate in Wiltshire, who had known every horse by name and temperament, who had once spent an entire afternoon teaching her to distinguish a green hoof from a sound one, and whose name she had written in the front of a worn prayer book at the age of 17, and had not once, in the 14 years since, failed to speak before God. She had not known, until that moment, whether he was alive. The ratafia glass was cold against her fingers. She set it on a passing footman's tray and turned toward the terrace doors, and the autumn air came in cold and clean and smelled of nothing that could hurt her. She was 31 years old. She had been a duchess for 12 of those years, widowed for 2. She did not, in any practical sense, have reason for the breathlessness that had descended on her between one heartbeat and the next. She breathed. He had not looked at her. He would not look at her. That was all she needed to know. The season would be brief. She could endure it. Margaret had been enduring for a long time. She had come to Ashcroft Hall at 18, a bride in cream silk with her father's best gloves on her hands, and a stillness in her chest she had not known how to name, and she had spent the intervening years learning the architecture of a life she had not chosen. The late Duke of Ashcroft had been a decent man, distant and correct, occupied primarily with his estates and his correspondence, and he had required very little of her beyond presence and the production of an heir, which she had failed at quietly 3 times before the matter was dropped without discussion. He had died of a fever in the autumn of 1811, leaving her the title, the house in Bath, and a jointure that sustained her without extravagance, and leaving the Ashcroft estate and its complications to the next male heir, a young cousin in Shropshire she had met twice. What the late Duke had not left her, because he had not known it to leave, was what Mr. Hendry the solicitor had found in the estate papers 6 months after the funeral. It was a private letter, written in the Duke's own hand in the final year of his life, confirming that the small property at Castlemore, a cottage on the Wiltshire land where she had grown up and where her father had kept his horses, was to be held for Margaret's use and benefit for as long as she required it. The solicitor had not yet presented the letter. He was, as he put it, waiting for an appropriate occasion. Margaret had not pressed him. She was not sure yet what she would do with an appropriate occasion. What occupied her more immediately was Lady Constance. The Dowager Duchess of Ashcroft was 63 years old and had lived in the great house at Ashcroft Hall since her marriage at 19 to the previous Duke. She had survived that husband, and the one after, and she had managed the family's social and financial arrangements with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had decided, early in her life, that sentiment was a luxury and efficiency was a virtue. She was not unkind to Margaret. She was, which was almost worse, purely practical. Margaret was a function of the estate, a respectable widow of impeccable rank who represented the Ashcroft name at dinners and assemblies, who deferred to Lady Constance in matters of household and alliance, and who would, when the appropriate interval of mourning had concluded, be usefully remarried to someone whose connections or capital reinforced the family position. The appropriate interval had, in Lady Constance's calculation, recently concluded. Viscount Pelham was 44 years old, possessed of a fine estate in Kent, and a disposition Lady Constance described as settled. He had called at Ashcroft Hall twice in the past month. He had sent flowers that Margaret had placed in the hall vase without cutting their stems, which was the only protest available to her that Lady Constance could not reasonably address. That evening, before the ball, Lady Constance had said, with the particular gentleness she used for decisions already made, that she hoped Margaret would be sensible this season. "You have always been a creature of sentiment," she had said, adjusting Margaret's pearls by a quarter inch without being asked. One cannot build a future on sentiment. It was not the first time she had said it. It would not be the last. Margaret had nodded and gone downstairs. In her room, on the small table beside her bed, the prayer book lay closed. Its spine was soft from years of handling. She had owned it since she was 15, a confirmation gift from her mother, and she had written in the front cover at 17 in the ink of a girl who did not yet know what she was doing. She wrote a name in small, neat letters because she had no other way to keep it. Thomas Vane. She said it every night before she slept. Not as a wish. She had stopped permitting herself wishes within the first year of her marriage. As a fact. As an acknowledgement that something had existed and been real and had mattered to her when she was very young, and that she would not, whatever else she relinquish the act of remembering it. If anyone found the book, she could say it was a servant she had known. No one would investigate further. No one had ever found the book. She turned from the terrace doors back toward the ballroom. Across the room he was accepting a glass from a footman and speaking to Lord Kittlebrook with an expression of mild attention that revealed nothing whatsoever. She watched the line of his jaw. She watched the way he held himself, the slight tension in his shoulders that had always been there, the one thing she could recognize, unchanged, across 14 years, and the entire distance of what both of them had become. He still had not looked at her. It was possible, she thought, that he did not remember her at all. She was not sure which version of that truth she could bear. The evening continued. It continued at some length, as evenings in the first months of one's return to society always do, with the weight of being observed measured against the equal weight of being required to observe. Lady Constance moved through the room with the purposefulness of someone making investments, and Viscount Pelham found Margaret at the lemonade table and spoke to her for 11 minutes about his estate's drainage improvements and Miss Arabella Fife, who had arrived on the arm of Lady Constance's particular friend, Mrs. Hartley, and whose gown was a color that could only be described as aspirational, smiled at him from across the room twice and received, both times, a polite nod in return. Margaret did not look at him again. She was careful about it. She returned home with Lady Constance at 11 and said her prayers with her usual precision and went to sleep. She did not dream. She had learned not to, a long time ago. The following morning brought rain and, unexpectedly, a visitor. Margaret had risen early, as was her custom, slipping through the sleeping house in the gray pre-dawn light to make her way to the library. She had grown accustomed to this hour in her widowhood, the only hour that genuinely belonged to her, before the household's machinery reasserted its claim. The library at Ashcroft Hall was a long room at the east end of the house, floor to ceiling in books, a fire usually laid but not yet lit at that hour, 2 wing chairs facing a window that looked out over the kitchen garden. It was cold in the mornings. She had learned to ignore cold. Old Mrs. Poole was waiting in her usual chair. Mrs. Chuai. Poole had been the Ashcroft housekeeper for 37 years and had gone gradually blind over the past 4, a process she bore with a pragmatic resentment that Margaret found, if she was honest, quietly admirable. She could not read any more. She had confided this to Margaret on a morning 6 months past, not as a complaint, but as a statement of fact, and Margaret had said, without thinking, that she could read to her if she liked, and they had established this arrangement without making any ceremony of it. This morning it was a volume of Scottish poetry. Mrs. Poole had grown up in Dumfriesshire and retained a fierce attachment to the verses of her youth. Margaret settled into the opposite chair, tucked her feet beneath her, and began. She was 3 pages in when she felt it. Not sound, not movement. A change in the quality of the air in the doorway, a sensation she had no rational name for, the particular awareness her body had always possessed in the vicinity of this one person that operated entirely without the permission of her mind. She kept reading. She kept her voice level and unhurried. She turned the page. She did not look up. Mrs. Poole sighed happily at a stanza she particularly loved. Margaret finished the page and set the ribbon in the book and closed it gently, and said that she would continue tomorrow, and helped Mrs. Poole to her feet, and rang for the woman's granddaughter to come and help her to breakfast. She waited until they were gone. She waited another full minute. Then she turned toward the doorway. It was empty. She stood in the cold library with her hands around the closed book of poetry, and breathed slowly. She was not certain. She was almost certain. She was, in the particular way her body had always been unreliable on this specific subject, quite completely certain. He had been there. She did not know what he had seen. The question followed her for the remainder of the morning, through breakfast, through the household accounts Lady Constance set before her at 9, through the rain that came and went and came again against the tall windows of the morning room. She was pouring her second cup of tea when the door opened and Lady Constance entered with Miss Fife, and then, a step behind them, with the constrained ease of a man who had been brought somewhere and not quite invited, the new Earl of Dunvale. Lady Constance made the introduction with the smoothness of someone who had decided this was a social nicety rather than an event. Your Grace, you will recall the new Earl of Dunvale. His estate at Meldresham borders ours on the east side. It seemed natural that he should call. Natural. Margaret set down her teacup. Lord Dunvale, she said. Your Grace, he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it. She had not been prepared for that. He was looking at her now. She had wondered, in the abstract, what she would feel when he finally looked at her directly. What she felt was her pulse in her throat, in her wrists, in places the season would not have permitted her to mention. Lady Constance was already organizing them into chairs with the efficiency of someone arranging furniture. "I hope you are finding the season agreeable, my lord," Miss Fife said from the chair to his right. "I find it instructive," he said. His gaze had moved to the window, and the word came out level and calibrated, giving nothing to anyone. Lady Constance smiled. "Lord Dunvale is too modest. He has been received everywhere with great warmth. The warmth of a room that has decided how to categorize you is not the same as warmth," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite bitterness. Too controlled for that. And he did not look at Margaret when he said it. But she understood, with the certainty of someone who had thought about this man's interior life at length over 14 years, that he had said it for her benefit. She looked at her teacup. He was shown the house over the next 2 hours, at Lady Constance's direction, as she described the points of interest with the practiced fluency of someone who had conducted this particular tour many times. Margaret was included in the party because exclusion would have required an excuse she did not have. She walked beside Miss Fife. Thomas walked with Lady Constance at the front, his hands behind his back, his attention apparently entire. Only once did he fall back to her side. It was in the portrait gallery when Lady Constance paused to say something emphatic to Miss Fife about a particular landscape, and Thomas turned to look at a painting of the north lawn as though it required consideration. "You were in the library this morning?" he said, quietly. "Not a question." She kept her eyes on the portrait facing her. "I go there most mornings." "I know." A pause. "I came down early. I did not know you kept that habit still." He had known she kept it. He was telling her he had known. She could feel the weight of 14 years pressing against her sternum with something that felt very much like her own heartbeat. "She is blind now," Margaret said. "Mrs. Poole, she cannot read for herself." A silence that lasted precisely long enough. "That was kind of you," he said. Low, even, the words landing without decoration, and then Lady Constance called from the far end of the gallery, and he crossed to her with 3 steps, and Margaret stood alone beside the portrait of the north lawn and breathed. She thought. He called it kind. She thought. He did not know yet. He could not know yet. He thought her silence at 17 had been disdain. She thought. He had come down early and stood in the doorway of the library and watched her read poetry to a blind housekeeper, and he had called it kind. She thought, with a grief she could not afford, that this was perhaps the worst of all possible outcomes. She tucked both thoughts away and rejoined the party. If you have ever kept a name in a private place, somewhere it could not be examined or judged, somewhere its weight was yours alone, then you will understand something of what the next weeks asked of Margaret. Stay with her. She is not finished yet. The visit to Castlemore came on a Tuesday afternoon when the weather had, briefly and unexpectedly, decided to be fine. Lady Constance had proposed a riding party to inspect the eastern boundary of the property, which adjoined the Dunvale land, and had arranged it with the particular thoroughness she brought to any activity that served a dual purpose, the ride itself and the company she had assembled for the ride, which included Viscount Pelham and Lord Dunvale and Miss Fife and Margaret. Margaret had not been back to Castlemore since before her marriage. The cottage stood at the edge of the old Wiltshire land, small and white-painted, with a stone stable attached and a kitchen garden that Mrs. Poole's predecessor had once tended. It was locked and had been since her father's death. The riding party paused at its gate, and Lady Constance made a brief remark about the property's potential usefulness, and Viscount Pelham nodded with the considered appreciation of a man evaluating an asset, and Miss Fife said something about the garden's charming neglect. Margaret looked at the stable. She was off her horse and through the gate before she had made a decision about it. And no one said anything, because she was the Duchess of Ashcroft, and the property belonged, in some sense that Mr. Hendry's letter had yet to make official, to her. She walked across the wet grass and pushed the stable door open. It smelled of old straw and dust, and beneath that, very faintly, the specific combination of horse and leather and wood that she associated entirely and permanently with being 17. She stood inside the door. The stalls were empty. The light came in through a high window in a single pale bar. She heard him behind her. "I knew you would come in here," Thomas said. She did not turn around. "Did you?" He stepped inside. He did not close the door. The propriety of this was marginal, and they both understood it, and neither of them moved to address it. "I found something," he said, 14 years ago, before I left your father's service." His voice was even. She had learned, or was learning, that evenness in him was not absence of feeling, but the discipline he used to contain it. "I did not understand it at the time. I have understood it better since." She turned. He was holding a prayer book. Her prayer book. She recognized the cover before she could form a response, the specific shade of faded green, the worn corner where she had always held it in the same grip. She had not missed it immediately. She had been in such a state when she was taken away. Her mother's voice in the hall, the carriage, the speed with which everything she had known had been packed into trunks and transported. She had assumed it was lost. She had mourned it at some point, quietly, and acquired another. "It was in the beam above the second stall," Thomas said. "You used to leave things there when you did not want them found." She said nothing. Her throat was very tight. He set the prayer book on the top of the stall rail between them and stepped back. He had not opened it. She could see from his face that he had opened it, once, long ago, and that he knew what was inside the front cover. "I never understood," he said, "why you said nothing." She looked at the prayer book. She looked at him. "The night before the announcement," he said, "I told you how I felt. You stood there in the south paddock and you looked at me and you said nothing. I was a stable hand. I know what silence means in the machinery this world operates by. I know what I was worth against a duke's offer." "You were not worth less," she said. Her voice came out lower than she intended. "I was worth less to the arrangement," he said. "That was the only calculation that mattered." She took the prayer book from the rail. She held it in both hands, the way she had held it for 14 years without it. She could not tell him, standing in a stable on a Tuesday afternoon with Viscount Pelham in the garden 15 feet away, what she had not been permitted to tell him at 17. She could not tell him that her mother had taken her inside before she could speak, that the engagement had been announced the following morning as something already decided, that she had wept in the carriage the entire way to Ashcroft Hall and been scolded for it, and learned, in the months that followed, not to weep where it could be seen. She said, "I was not silent because you were worth less." She watched his jaw set. She watched him decide something. "I spent some years," he said carefully, "being angry. I spent some others deciding it did not matter, because I was going to build something that proved it did not need to matter. And then I came back here, and you were here still." He looked at her. "You were still here." "I have been here rather a long time," she said. "I know." He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, and occupied the space between the two with uncommon precision. "And I find that I cannot be as settled about it as I intended to be." He moved past her to the stable door. He paused in the frame. "Keep the book," he said. "It has been yours a long time." He went back out into the pale afternoon. She stood in the old stable with the prayer book in her hands, and the weight of what she could not yet say pressed against her ribs, and outside she could hear Lady Constance's voice rising in the middle register she used when organizing people, and Viscount Pelham's measured response, and Miss Fife's bright, agreeable laugh. She breathed. She was not finished. She was afraid, nowhere near finished. The dinner at Ashcroft Hall 3 evenings later was Lady Constance's most deliberate to date. She had invited 14, arranged the seating with the geometry of someone building a case, and placed Viscount Pelham at Margaret's right hand and Lord Dunvale at the far end of the table beside Miss Fife, where the distance between them could be maintained with complete social deniability. Margaret watched the distance maintained. She watched Miss Fife address Thomas with the comfortable ease of a young woman who had been told, by someone whose opinion she trusted, that she was the appropriate match for the Earl of Dunvale. She watched Thomas receive Miss Fife's attention with the same courteous inscrutability he brought to everything, and she noted, somewhere under her sternum, the specific temperature of watching someone you had loved be offered to someone who did not know you had loved them. It was not a pleasant temperature. Lady Constance rose, midway through the second course, to propose that they discuss the season's upcoming arrangements, and in doing so, turned to Margaret with a precision that had the quality of an orchestrated moment. "We must not allow the Duchess's sentiment to cloud what is practical," she said, with a smile whose warmth was entirely genuine and whose function was entirely surgical. "There are decisions to be made about the autumn, and I think we would all agree that a settled arrangement would suit the household best." Viscount Pelham inclined his head. Miss Fife glanced at Thomas. Margaret did not look at him. She looked at her plate, at the pale flesh of the fish, at the pattern on the rim of the china she had lived with for 12 years, without ever selecting it. She said, "I am quite sensible of what is practical, my lady." "I know you are, my dear," Lady Constance said. "You have always been. It is only the question of acting upon it." The dinner continued. After, in the drawing room, Margaret found herself near the window while the men rejoined the ladies, and she stood with her back half turned to the room, watching the rain come against the dark glass, and Miss Fife settled beside her and said, with the breezy candor of a young woman who did not know she was delivering a wound, "Lord Dunvale is very decided in his opinions. Is he not? He was saying at dinner, I could hear it from across the table, he has a carrying sort of voice when he is earnest, that he has very little patience with women who lack directness. He said something about sentiment being a poor substitute for honesty, that the lady who hides behind delicacy rather than speaking plainly wastes everyone's time." She laughed lightly. "I found it rather bracing, actually, though I suppose it would sting if one had reason to feel addressed by it." She moved away to join the others. Margaret remained at the window. She thought, "He believes I could have spoken. He believes my silence was a choice of the same quality as his, a deliberate withholding. He believes I chose the Duke when I had another option." She thought. "In his version, I selected my position over his dignity, and have spent 14 years in the comfort of a life I chose." She thought. From that version of the story, sentiment is not grief. It is indulgence. It is the luxury of a woman who made a practical choice and then allowed herself the pretty sorrow of praying for what she gave up. Lady Constance appeared at her elbow. "Viscount Pelham would like to speak with you privately," she said. "I said Thursday morning." Margaret opened her mouth. "It is the right thing," Lady Constance said quietly. "Not unkind. Simply irresistible." There is nothing keeping you from a settled life, Margaret. Nothing but the sentiment I spoke of. And sentiment fades. It always does. Margaret looked at the dark window. She thought of the prayer book, which she had placed on the table in her room tonight, and of the name inside it in her 17-year-old hand. And she thought that Lady Constance was perhaps right. Not about what she meant, but about what remained. She nodded. She said, "Thursday morning." It was the worst decision she made. It lasted approximately 16 hours. Thomas did not arrive at the Thursday appointment. He arrived 2 hours before it. He arrived at 9:30 in the morning without a calling card and without announcement, which was not the behavior of an earl, and which the footman had apparently decided to permit, because the Earl of Dunvale had the manner of a man who had decided what he intended to do and was going to do it without pausing for the household's administrative processes. Margaret heard his voice in the entrance hall and came to the top of the stairs and saw him standing in the marble entrance with his hat still in his hand, and his jaw with the set that she now understood as the discipline he used when he felt a great deal. He looked up and saw her. "Come down," he said. "Please." It was not the sort of please that was asking. It was the sort that had thought carefully about what it required. She came down. He said, in the voice he used when he was not going to raise it, "I heard this morning from Mr. Kittlebrook. He rode out from Dunvale last night to tell me that a marriage arrangement with Viscount Pelham is to be announced for you Thursday morning. He heard it from his wife, who had it from Lady Constance directly. I need to know if this is true." "It was going to be," she said. He looked at her with the particular expression she had now catalogued as the one where his face was not giving anything, but his eyes were giving everything. "Was," he said. "I have not agreed yet," she said. From the end of the hall, Lady Constance's footstep. Thomas turned and said, at a volume the entire hall could hear, "I need 5 minutes in the drawing-room with Her Grace. I think you know why." Lady Constance appeared at the end of the hall. She took in Lord Dunvale, his hat, his expression. Margaret saw the calculation happen behind her eyes, the rapid assessment of what could and could not be managed. 5 minutes, she said, and it sounded like a concession, and was probably a retreat. Thomas set his hat on the table at the foot of the stairs and walked to the drawing-room, and Margaret followed him. He reached into his coat and placed the prayer book on the low table at the center of the room. She had left it on her bedroom table. He should not have been able to have it. She looked at it, and then at him. "I kept it," he said. "I kept it for 14 years. I told myself it was because I never had occasion to return it. I told myself a great many things about it." He looked at the book. "I told myself that if a woman of your station had written a servant's name in the front of her prayer book at 17, she had done it from the sentimentality of a girl who was bored, and that whatever she had felt was real to her in the way that girls' feelings are real, in the moment, in the body, and then over, when the appropriate arrangement arrives, and the carriage comes, and the silence is maintained." She said his name. She had not said it since she was 17. It came out of her without ceremony, without planning, in her own actual voice. "Thomas." He was very still. "I was not silent," she said, "because you were worth less. I was not silent because I had chosen. I was silent because my mother came through the garden door in the 60 seconds between your speaking and my answering, and because the announcement was made the following morning before I was permitted to speak to you again, and because I was 18 years old, and the carriage came, and I spent that entire journey weeping until I could not breathe. And I have prayed for you every night since because it was the only thing left to me that was true." Her voice was steady. She was, she discovered, capable of this. She had been practicing it in some interior room for a very long time. He stood looking at her across the small table with the prayer book between them. Mr. Hendry appeared in the doorway, which was not coincidental. She would understand later that Thomas had stopped at the solicitor's office on his way, had presented himself and his intentions with the specificity of a man who had considered every practical angle and had asked Mr. Hendry to be present for the morning. The solicitor entered and placed a folded letter on the table beside the prayer book, and Margaret recognized the late Duke's handwriting on the seal. "Your Grace," Mr. Hendry said, "this letter has been in my keeping for nearly 2 years. It establishes your right to the Castlemore property and its income in full, independent of any subsequent arrangement the household may undertake. I should have presented it sooner. I apologize for the delay." Lady Constance had appeared in the doorway. Behind her, Viscount Pelham. And behind him, in the particular arrangement that Lady Constance had assembled for what was supposed to be a conclusive Thursday morning, Miss Fife and Mrs. Hartley and 2 other ladies of the county. Thomas turned to face the room. He was not loud. He did not need to be loud. "Her Grace has managed her affairs and her obligations in this house with a fidelity that has cost her considerably," he said. He was looking at Lady Constance with an expression of complete composure and absolute firmness. She had an independent right to her own property and was not informed of it. She was presented with an arrangement she did not seek and was not consulted in. I am telling you now, in front of your witnesses and mine, that the arrangement with Viscount Pelham will not proceed." Lady Constance said, "Lord Dunvale, you are not a member of this family, and you have no standing." "Her name has never left my prayers either, madam," Thomas said. 11 words. Quiet, specific, absolute. Lady Constance's fan stopped moving. Miss Fife, in the doorway, blinked once and stepped back. Viscount Pelham, who was a sensible man, whatever else could be said of him, looked at Lord Dunvale's expression and made the accurate assessment that this was not a morning he had been correctly informed about. Lady Constance looked for a long moment at the prayer book on the table. She looked at Margaret's face. Something shifted in her expression. It was not collapse, nothing so dramatic. She was too old and too composed for collapse. It was more the look of a woman who had believed herself in possession of the complete information and had now discovered a fact she had not accounted for, and who was, privately, reckoning with what it meant. She said at last to Margaret rather than to Thomas, "I did not know." "No," Margaret said. "You could not have." A silence. "Mr." Hendry cleared his throat gently and began discussing the practical details of the Castlemore letter, which he had clearly been waiting a long time to discuss, and the room rearranged itself around this new information with the awkward efficiency of people who are trying to locate the appropriate social posture for a situation none of them had prepared for. Margaret stood with the prayer book in her hands and looked at Thomas across the room, and he looked back at her. And his face had, for the first time since she had seen him across the ballroom 3 weeks ago, let go of its careful composure. He looked, she thought, the way he had looked at 17. Not the boy, but the feeling beneath the discipline, the particular quality of attention he had always given her, and only her, the one that had made her write his name in the front of a book and speak it to God every night for 14 years, because she had no other place to put it, she thought. This is what was always true. This is what, she thought. I have been keeping it alive in the only way I knew. She thought, with the quiet relief of a door finally opened, and it was enough. The Castlemore cottage was small and white, and sat at the edge of the old Wiltshire property in the early December light, as though it had been waiting. The kitchen garden was frost-bitten but recoverable, Mrs. Poole's granddaughter had already declared opinions about what should be planted in spring, and the parlor had 2 chairs facing the fire that had clearly been chosen by someone who understood the dimensions of a room you actually intended to live in rather than display. Margaret had been in the cottage for 6 weeks. Thomas had been in it for most of them, arriving by horse from his own estate at Dunvale with the systematic regularity of a man who had decided something and intended to be consistent about it. He had not proposed formally. He had not made speeches. He had arrived the first week with 3 men to repair the stable roof, and the second week with a packet of Mrs. Poole's favorite tea, and the third week with a look on his face that she had recognized as the question he was building toward. And by the 4th week, the look had been answered without any of the formal machinery the world required for answering it, and they were engaged in the quiet, certain way of 2 people who had been moving toward each other for a very long time, through a great deal of terrain that had not made it easy. Lady Constance had been correct. She was a practical woman, and once the morning in the drawing-room had resettled itself into a new arrangement of facts, she had applied her practicality to the new configuration with the same thoroughness she had brought to the old one. There had been a letter. It had been measured and correct, and had contained in its 4th paragraph 1 sentence that Margaret did not show Thomas and was not going to show him. "I did not know you were unhappy. I would not have known how to account for it." Margaret had written back, "I was not always unhappy. I was most often, simply, missing something I could not name to you." She thought that was perhaps the most honest she had ever been in a letter to Lady Constance, and she thought the correspondence would be better for it. On the evening she is remembering now, the fire was lit, and the day outside had gone entirely dark, and the frost had come early, pressing against the parlor windows in fine white lines at the corners of the glass. Thomas was reading. She had discovered in the past weeks that he had always been, a reader. A habit acquired in the hours after the horses were settled. She supposed the private discipline of a young man who had decided that what he could not purchase in his situation, he could steal from the gaps in it. He had a way of reading that occupied him entirely, a stillness that was the genuine version of the controlled stillness he deployed in company, and she had found that she liked to watch it. She reached for the prayer book on the mantel. She did not know what made her open the front cover. She had opened it many times, of course. She knew the inscription by heart. The name, in her 17-year-old hand. In the ink she had pressed carefully so it would last. His name. Faded now, soft with years, still legible. Below it, in a different hand. In his hand, she recognized it already. She had the letter from that morning to compare it against. 2 words, added at some point in 14 years, in a slightly darker ink, below her inscription and hers. She sat very still. He looked up. He saw her face. He set the book down. "I found it in the stable," he said. "The same day I found yours. I did not understand either of them at first. I understood mine a little better as the years went on." She looked at the 2 words. She looked at the name above them, in her own hand, the girl she had been, the act of preserving something real in the only way she had. The fire moved. The frost pressed at the corners of the glass. Somewhere in the kitchen, Mrs. Poole's granddaughter was clattering with the kettle in the cheerful, imprecise way of someone young in a house that had recently become a home again. Thomas reached across and took the prayer book from her hands and set it on the mantel, and then took her hands in both of his, and she felt the warmth of them, the specific and particular warmth that her body had recognized since she was 17 and had been carrying ever since in the place where her prayers lived. She thought. We kept each other. She thought. All those years, the prayers went both ways. She thought, for the last time, because she was not going to need to think it much longer. It was enough. We both held on. The fire burned steadily. The frost deepened. His hands were warm around hers, and outside the parlor window the first snow of December was beginning to fall. Very soft, very quiet, on the Castlemore garden. She closed her eyes. She breathed. Thank you for staying until the end of their story. If Margaret's 14 years moved you, leave a word in the comments. It means more than you know.